was riding my bike downtown one day, and I was thinking about classical music, as I often do. And I was thinking specifically about the case of Franz Joseph Haydn, who had probably the most unique setup in the history of music, in that he lived with his patron, the Esterhazy family, and they basically had Haydn as their house composer. And so he had an orchestra. They had a standing orchestra that was his to command. He's able to go upstairs, write a piece of music, come downstairs, hand the parts out to the orchestra, say, play this, they play it. He's able to go back upstairs, revise it, do whatever he wants. He can actually hear the music performed by live musicians, and he can make changes, and of course what's handed down to us is the final masterpiece. And I've always thought it would be very interesting if you could be a fly on the wall while this is happening, and you could see the process. If you could actually hear the piece developed from its first idea. Wouldn't it be interesting if we could somehow recreate this, where a composer has a group of professional musicians that could be recording the piece as he's writing it? And then I thought it'd be even more interesting if we could use the internet to basically work with a composer anywhere in the world. You know, the composer wouldn't even have to be here in Chicago. We could work with a composer that we've never even met before, completely on the other side of the world.
About 15 years ago, a furnace went out in my house, and my wife called the furnace repairman. The guy who came to the house was, she said, right out of central casting for a furnace repairman. In his 30s, overalls, tools sticking out of his back pocket. He walked in, and he happened to walk by my admittedly obscenely large record collection. And he said something like, oh my God, that's a lot of records. What kind? And my wife said, oh, it's classical music. He said, you know, I love classical music. Do you ever go to the symphony? My wife said, well, my husband happens to manage it, so we go all the time. And this guy, who knew classical music, listened to it, said, you know, I'd love to go, but I don't own a tuxedo. Now, we created that image. I mean, you could laugh, but the fact is he really seriously believed it.
Laura Kopel-Tenjis and I started Accessible Contemporary Music in 2000 because we wanted to take classical music to a wider audience. We came up with the name Accessible Contemporary Music because to us it was like having a mission statement and a name for the group rolled up all in one. Accessibility to us means that we're going to perform in places where this music is not being heard. We're going to take it to jazz clubs, we take it to bars, theaters, and churches, and schools. And we play contemporary music because we want to show that this is not a dead tradition. Classical music is still very much a living tradition. There are musicians all around the world writing classical music today. And there's this misconception that it's dead, that it's closed off.
I've been in the classical music business now for 43 years, since 1963. And for 43 years, one of the most frustrating and even infuriating aspects of the classical music world to me is that it created a situation, and it did, it is the classical music industry that did, created a situation that scared off its audience, that made you feel that if you didn't know a lot about it, you wouldn't enjoy it. No other art form does that. I'll bet you people who feel, I can't go into a concert hall, I don't know enough, have never felt that way about going into the theater, have never felt that way about going into an art museum. And yet, they feel that way. Why? Well, number one, we used to write program notes that if you didn't have a degree in musicology, you couldn't understand. Talking about the retrograde inversion of the secondary fugue theme resolving on the harmonic seventh. Meaningless to 90% of the people. We had classical music radio announcers who speak in deep, reverent tones, and you almost see a halo sitting over the radio because you are doing a good thing by listening to Brahms. One of my favorite pet peeves is if you applaud between movements, you get sneered at. That's a 20th century convention. It would shock Beethoven, it would shock Tchaikovsky, it would shock Mahler not to have applause. I mean, there are wonderful documented examples. Berlioz wrote an essay on the Beethoven symphonies, and he said the Seventh Symphony of Beethoven, the second movement is the most beloved by audience because it always gets the longest applause. Edward Elgar wrote to his wife, who was too sick to go to the premiere of his Second Symphony, They applauded so long after the second movement that we had to repeat it before we could finish the symphony. "Isn't that wonderful?" said Elgar. Today, if you applauded after that slow movement, people would shush you because you're ruining the mood. Well, in fact, the next movement comes in with a totally different mood. The mood is supposed to go. And the real reason that this tradition started was so that smart people could show you that they knew the piece wasn't over. And so we've done a terrible disservice. We basically have created a climate in which we have intimidated people and scared them off of our art form.
Many of the big, well-known classical composers like Beethoven and Mozart have gotten onto this exalted plane where we think of them as gods, as torchbearers for Western civilization itself.
The word composer alone is so intimidating. A composer isn't even a flesh and blood human being. A composer is a bust you see on a piano. A composer is a dead guy from 200 years ago. That's a composer. The whole concept of the Composer Alive program is that this is a living person who's creating a piece of music. The genesis for Eastern Expressions was our weekly readings program, in which we record a different piece of music by a living composer every week and post it to our website so that anyone in the world can hear it. That expanded into our Composer Alive program, in which we work with one composer who writes a piece for us in installments, and we record and post each installment as he's writing it. That way, our online audience gets to hear the piece grow and develop and follow along with the creative process. Then, to maximize the impact of collaborating through the internet, we thought, let's work with someone on the other side of the world completely from us, from a totally different culture. And that became the Eastern Expressions Project.
This is a kind of a coming out for China culturally. It very much wants to be on the world stage, and part of being on the world stage is building opera houses, building concert halls. Indeed, the audiences are huge, and the music is just growing. I think that in the musical arts, they're also trying to find ways to embrace the new, to try to find a classical medium, a musical medium, often with Chinese characteristics, as they would say, but something that is also accessible to audiences throughout the world. Coming up with the Olympics, I'm sure that we're going to have incredible musical events surrounding the 2008 Olympics.